I have a couple of items that I was tracking inside of the Slack to talk about today, and then feel free to bring up anything that you'd like to talk about in regard to cloud or other things in general. The first item being that over in the POP channel on Slack, there seems to be some discussion going back and forth as to what POP and item and how that relates to cloud really fit together. So I just wanted to take a couple of minutes to give my best stab at it, and Tyler, maybe you could chime in too and really speak to how cloud is really utilizing these new projects and how they all fit together. So from my perspective, POP is really the framework on which things are built, but it doesn't do anything. So I don't want people to think that like POP is a thing that is executing cloud states or things in general. POP is really the framework that allows you to write software in a pluggable way. If you happen to write an application or a plugin in using the POP paradigm, what that allows you to do is merge in other applications or plugins that utilize that same paradigm. So for instance, the Azure provider or the AWS provider for cloud, they're really meant to be plugins to other POP applications. Currently, the Azure plugin doesn't do anything by itself. You couldn't utilize it to run things from the command line. Could you do that in the future? Sure. If we extended that plugin to be able to have its own command line utility to do things against Azure, it could certainly do that, but currently it's just meant to be a plugin. You need to leverage another POP application item in order to do things with that Azure provider currently. What item is, in my own words, is really Salt's state system. So, all of the Salt states that you're used to writing, defining that YAML framework to do things and enforce idempotent states, that's really what item represents. And then there's other POP applications that can merge into item to provide additional functionality. So I think Tyler has been working on the POP version of grains, which he's dubbed corn at this point.
Yeah, that's going to change.
Working
Why
title.
changing?
Well, it's too corny. And
Fun?
and that's just one pun that
But grains can be used as a standalone POP application. From what I gather, you can dump all of the information about a system using just that app. But really where it becomes powerful is merging into other POP applications that can use that information in order to do things, right? Like using the OS family grain to determine which sections of a state are going to be enforced, your standard workflows inside of the state system. So that's really how I see all of those things fitting together. And I just wanted to take a couple of minutes and clarify that. Tyler, if you have anything to add to that, feel free, and then we can sort of open it up and see if anybody has any questions about that.
Sure. There are a couple goals we have with POP by the end of the quarter, because we now have an official R&D team, which is 3 people, including myself, that are we're trying to break up Salt into chunks that are manageable and that can do things by themselves. One of those things is Salt Cloud. We want to break Salt Cloud into its own projects. I mean, that was one of Salt Cloud's, that's something we wanted to do with Salt Cloud for a while. But one of the other tools we want to do it with is with the package manager. Like we can break item package into its own repo, and now on any OS, you'll have a standalone package manager that works the same every time. So it's another piece of Salt that'll be really great to have on its own. But we'll also go into the new functionality of all this POP stuff together. Yeah, that's all I have to say about it.
Awesome. Does anybody have any particular questions about POP or certain POP projects and how they fit into the ecosystem?
Not about how it fits in the ecosystem, but I guess since I think I'm one of these topics, I can hold my comments for a little bit, but I do have some thoughts if we want to cover it now.
Go for it.
So first is, can you maybe Tyler talk a little more about what the development team or where the goals are going to be? I really appreciate your help this week because I finally got into doing some things that I've been meaning to get to, and it's been very stop and start. Like I did notice that pop upgraded from what is it 08 to 09, or item did, I don't remember. I just upgraded everything. It's like, oh, suddenly I was seeing backtraces and log messages, which apparently were getting swallowed before, which you mentioned. So that was very helpful. But I think there's definitely what I saw was trying to get started was a big gap between some different advice from different people who have different ways of getting started, following by where you're supposed to go, and it seems like a 5-step. This is how you would do an execution module in a state to get it done, not in cloud. Wasn't among the first things that I remember getting or that I have in my open links. Maybe it was there, but I just couldn't find it. But it seems like it could more readily be in like the main README or something like that in order to be most useful.
I agree with you a lot. The documentation, it's something that is a work in progress, and working with you actually has spurred a bunch of changes in how we're documenting it in just the past few days. So I really appreciate that too. And also goes for anyone that's trying to move a cloud or do a project on POP. I'm willing to sit down with you for an hour. We can get in a Zoom call and I'll help you get started with it. That's part of my role in doing the R&D is I'll help you do anything you want to do in POP. Because yeah, the documentation can be confusing because it's incomplete and we don't know yet. Because POP is very, very young, less than 6 months old, we don't know exactly where someone would want to get started.
Right.
Yeah, it is good to know that in item, you just want to get a state working as a sanity check. So that is a good launch point.
Tyler?
Yeah.
Is there a plan to have an equivalent of the execution modules?
That already exists.
Okay.
Well, I mean, executing the execution modules is what you mean?
Yeah, like from the command line.
Oh, from the command line.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Let's see. We've thought about a number of ways of doing this, and if you have any suggestions, we'll take into account too. The current way we're thinking, let's see, with POP 10, we've redone how conf works. It's instead of having the conf system inside of POP, it's become its own project so that you can vertically merge conf systems more easily. For example, with Item Azure Cloud, you'd be able to inherit Item Cloud's command line, and then you would be able to use it as a standalone project. So, and we made it easy to, like, you could have item package and it will have all of its command line arguments, and then you can bundle it all into POP Linux and it will inherit all of the command line arguments from item package, from item, from all of the different things that it touches. So that's what the comp system in POP 10 will do. And one of the things we're consider that really is an issue is how to execute a state from the command line. Because in Salt, it's like there are very, very specific commands where you can say like package.install and then pass some options to it. But what's the right way to do
it? In the command line we have, in the Salt command line so far, it's just run as state.apply and the name of the state, and there you go. It's not that bad, at least from my perspective.
No, it's not terrible, but it's one of those things when you're right in the early stages where every time you're looking at the execution module, you have to, maybe it's not terrible if I put it this way, you have to look at what the arity should be and how the function looks. But if you're wrong and you're just experimenting with it, that's, you know, two more places you have to change it, once in the state you're testing with and another in the actual function in the state that invokes the execution module, to kind of put that down to try to figure out what you're actually trying to create. Probably not the biggest deal in things that are better understood, but right at the outset, it's a little bit, it's overhead, because you have potentially three things that might, for me, at the file system that have the same file name that you're looking at and trying to keep track of.
Right. So at least a states.apply would be the thing that you'd be looking for.
That'd be good. Or either we have a state.apply, or we have really clear different ways to call states or execution modules from the command line.
Okay.
It's
Yeah,
rather cumbersome to remember that you need to run a state.apply execution module to apply a state. I mean,
yeah, I mean, if you had separate command line utilities altogether, right, something akin to Ansible versus Ansible playbook, you know, it would really separate things more if you wanted to do that, instead of calling a state.apply execution module to apply a state, right? Handling execution modules the same way that Salt currently does could be interesting, though, considering that with the new framework, you could nest execution modules n number of levels deep. So you could end up with something like, you know, whatever command line, I'm going to execute this module, and it ends up being like Azure RM, compute, virtual machines, something underneath of it, right? So you know, you could have several dots where we used to only have one in the execution modules. I don't really see that as a problem so much as it's definitely a shift.
Yeah, and just now thinking about it, a test equals true is something that we could make very easy to implement. Because I don't know, has anyone written tests with POP yet?
So it has a test mode currently, right? --
It
test.
does, and there's a structure called a mock hub, which doesn't actually call any functions. It just follows which contracts get executed on the hub without actually calling those contracts. So it would be very easy to add a test equals true flag and then just have the mock hub get loaded instead of the actual hub.
Yeah, that's,
and then no one would ever have to implement their own test equals true. You just have it and you can see a path of what should have been done.
Yeah, because those test equal truths are littered all through the Azure RM, and it's just kind of, it's
Right.
great to have
And
it.
you never
as an
know if it's going to
example,
work or if it's actually going to execute because of how someone implemented it. That is a problem. Yeah, but that should be very easy.
but then just like always with the test equals true, even if you're calling the markups, there's always level where you want to stop. So where do you stop in the markups? So for example, in the virtualization states, I can go into the execution modules to try as much as possible to run a test, to test and not call the libvirt functions in the end. But you cannot do that with with just calling the markups.
That's true.
And even like that, you can just have something that succeeds. But when you run it against a real system, real libvirt, real whatever, it will just fail because something else is not taken into account. So there's no magic bullet for that.
We'll toy with it and see where we can go. If there is a magic bullet, I want to take it.
I don't think there is one. Just look at packages. You can just try to install packages, but
but then you can't actually know what would have been installed unless you actually run something. Yeah, I got you. Yeah. That's something personally that I want to make a lot better this time around for item, is having a test equals true that actually is meaningful. Or maybe something with contracts could make us enforce a test equals true.
What we really want is to have all contracts to implement states that to really implement that test equals true, because as of today in the salt states, it's not implemented everywhere.
Okay. Made a note of that.
Awesome. Does anybody have anything else in regards to more general pop type items before we move on? All right. Peter, you want to talk about progress that you made so far?
Sure. So just as a quick thing, I thought this would be I thought I'd have a little more time for this, but there's been personal life stuff, so that's been fine. But I basically got a few evenings to take a quick look. It looks to me like, I'm not very familiar with Azure, but that's the example. It looks like, AWS is a lot more loosey-goosey with certain permissions and certain restrictions on how it looks at the world, really, than Azure is. So it looks like a lot of the functionality looks similar, with the difference that you don't have like projects that or groupings that control everything the user has access to. So it looks like the API could be similar in some cases, will be very different in other cases, and that authentication is, to me, seems a little bit simpler, but maybe that's just because I'm used to AWS. And so some of those things started to become clearer. In addition, AWS's CLIs and APIs have sort of a standardized set of locations for where you can put authentication info, not just the environment, but instance resources. Instances specifically have metadata info that can get you authentication. So I spent some time noodling around in my head about how that should look. And in the end, I think for an initial thing, I can just ignore all of that and not configure salt and just assume that someone has something in an environment variable or on an instance you'd be testing in, and that would probably work. So I think I'm at the point where I can almost create a resource, and then I'm also at the point where I can actually properly execute a state. The biggest bump in getting there was just knowing that I have to set a Python, include the current directory in the Python path in order to get things working. And once that happened, it started to make more sense how things should work, because for the longest time, I wasn't doing like a pip install into a virtual env each cycle. So I wasn't getting my current module, because it didn't seem to make sense to me that I would want to do that. I guess I'd like it if I could continue developing by ignoring the fact that pop exists and just do the item part of it, the whole structure that's there, and the running of item in order to test my code out. And that might be a bias from, hey, kernel install it, you put an execution module in there and you run it, and it happens in the context of the salt master that you are dealing with, right? This is a little different and doesn't have that same ease of being able to just assume that, but it would be nice if it did. Setting Python path does about the same though. So
I'm trying to wrap my head around exactly what barrier you're running into there. So what was causing you to have to add the current directory to the path?
It just seems like if you create a new pop project, right, and you create an execution module, or you create a state, because the execution module doesn't even figure into this at this point, and then you run item, item dash SLS, the SLS file, unless that state is either, I believe, according to what I can see and read, though I haven't tried this, unless you use pip or run the setup.py that pop will put in that project, unless you use that to install the project in your virtual environment or your Python's path, or unless you set the Python path to being the root directory of the project you're in, then it won't find the SLS. It won't find the SLS. It won't find the state, the py file for it to implement the state that you've created.
Yeah, that's
Gotcha.
correct. You
Okay.
should have to. That is the way it works.
Yeah, pip installing as like a local editable module is probably the preferred route there.
Right, but if that feels like a relatively repetitive. It feels like a relatively repetitive step to run when you just want to edit a line and see what the difference is, for instance.
You shouldn't
right?
have to do it multiple times. You should only have to do it once.
Yeah, it'll pick up changes.
In development mode or something.
No,
Just
just
a
in
pip
general.
install -e in your directory and you're good to go.
Right. So it's not a regular pip install dot, right? I guess that's what I'm more used to. So it'll create the symlinks in rather than
Right.
that. Sure. I guess then that probably would have been the approach. Like I said, clearly I'm not used to doing that for what I'm working on. Most of my internal stuff, I've been trying to use Bazel, which kind of magics that in for you when it works with Python. And so I've just been like happily not using any of that and only using pip for packaging things.
Gotcha.
Right. So again, I'm not the common case here, but that sort of thing should be documented, I guess, or
I'll make a
maybe
note of that for docs.
like maybe even more clearly, maybe if it could be a development installation target that just scripts the installation for you of the environment or whatever it is that's appropriate. But like I said, I'm used to just doing like, hey, Bazel run whatever and everything runs. Obviously without the tooling that's not for free, but like I've made it pretty simple for myself in other situations. I'm hoping it can be here or something like a dash E would certainly work, but I guess just making it non-optional in a virtual environment, for instance, would seem like a win. If you could just say, hey, go this path and it'll all get done for you in a script or something. Anyway, that wasn't what we were talking about. So we have the things are there, and I've just started to work on a disk creation module. The pieces should work right now. Actually, most of what I have is copy pasta from the Azure in the execution module. Implementing it is the Azure RM actual virtual machine. So it's obviously not doing anything useful right now. I am probably going to go for just a minimum viable. It can create a volume with a couple of options and then figure out how thoroughly we want to. Without the ability to test an execution module, I guess I'm curious about how hairy we want the state to look in the end in terms of things that are optional, things that are mandatory, things that are checked, and how that should look.
So from a state perspective, the way I architected the Azure stuff is whatever is absolutely required to make that resource, I break out as a parameter, and then I just accept keyword arguments, mostly to make it flexible as the SDK changes out from underneath of it. As new options become available, if there's no other fundamental breaking changes, it should just work. And so that's kind of the tack that I've taken with it. But I'm not sure if that's the best way. It's just sort of the easiest way as I slammed through trying to create that a couple of years ago.
So my thought is that it would be, and this is also a general commentary on Salt and maybe more generally on a lot of Python code, is that slipping it up to Quargs without some kind of documentation as to what's known to work is a pretty common thing, but it's very difficult to know what could or should or what's expected to work. The open-endedness means often things do work once you find out how it's supposed to work. But I feel like it hides some of the complexity and makes it easier to get by without updating the documentation, which is, I feel, okay, it's a low blow, guys, but it is what it is.
Yeah.
And the other thing is the AWS API has been extremely stable. At least once something happens, it doesn't get revoked. Like Amazon is pretty maniacal about not letting things deprecate. And so I don't think I need to worry. I don't necessarily want to hide most things behind quargs. There may be things that I have to, but I really want to bring up front not just the things that are needed, but the things that are maybe most commonly there, even if it's just cutting and pasting or referencing the Bodo 3 docs. But there's also the question of like, do we have any conveniences for things that are mutually exclusive options or things like that that gets done in the parsing, because there will be a fair amount of that. I already noticed, for instance, that you put I guess it's no, I don't know who put it in there, but there's some copy pasted stuff from Stack Overflow for doing deep comparisons of dictionaries, which or of dictionaries and lists, which I think we've all cut and pasted into a lot of our own code in different places and times. Things like that seem like they belong somewhere not in each provider.
Yeah, so I think you're referencing like the utility calls inside of Azure, and given that it was the first provider and there was no other places and no real like, hey, we're going to stick this in this generalized place. Like, Salt's a big cohesive platform, and utils are just sort of there. So when you put them there, they're accessible by everything. With pop applications, it's a lot different, right? Depending on what gets merged in, it may or may not be there.
We don't
we
really
can declare
want to have
dependencies,
utils.
right? But we can
Yeah.
put in dependencies to say something like, I want the pop or the item deep merge functionality here.
Yeah.
If that were to be available.
Yeah. So I don't know, Tyler. I mean, I've heard the no utils tag before, right? And ultimately, what they are just more execution modules. But
yeah, and some of them are
there,
useful, but with pop being only on Python 3.6 and greater, a lot of them can go away. Where we have like the salt open
but
and the salt.
there surely are some that are still useful, just like the dictionary comparison, for example.
And those will just end up going into a different module. We're just not going to have something called utils.
Sure. I mean, I'm just saying that even if it starts out as something with a limited scope, like in this case, there should be. It seems like it would be useful to throw in deep comparisons. It seems like it would be worth throwing in something that does function. Every one of these execution modules essentially ends up being part of the CLI. It would be nice to have certain things that could be more declarative than if foo and bar, then break, if foo, then this path, if bar, that path. Just, to be able to sanity check it, to just say, hey, maybe in the type checking, this is required. I don't know. I mean, that doesn't work at runtime, unfortunately, with Python, does it? But it would be nice to be able to have a sanity checker as just something that you get mostly for free. I mean, whether it's a decorator or whether it's something you would invoke on all of your arguments, it would be nice to say, yeah, this is exclusive, this is not exclusive, and I'm just not going to think very hard about it. And it will return a message that's standardized in the right format so that I don't have to also come up with my own custom version of an error message.
Tyler, would it make sense to have some of these more standard things attached to item proper or as a module, right? Like, I can't foresee it ballooning too much in a general sense as long as it stays general.
Right.
But what do you think about that versus a separate thing? I mean, that way, anytime somebody is writing anything for item, they have this core of a few utilities that are useful and generally used in a lot of workflows.
I don't think it would go into item. I'm currently making a bunch of OS specific collections of utilities. Like there's Pop Linux, Pop Windows, and Pop Darwin right now as the basis. And I'm putting command.run into each of those first, but then I'll have the package, service, and file, and a couple other core execution modules at first, but that's where I would put all of them.
Yeah, I mean, these aren't even really execution modules, right? It's not something that somebody's going to invoke directly. You know, it's more like code management, code reuse type things. You know, like I'm going to do a diff on these dictionaries. I need to do like, you know, deep comparisons on these dictionaries, and it's never going to escape, right? It's used internally inside of the execution modules, state modules, in order to determine if there's a difference between, you know, an existing Azure resource and a new one. Uh, I think that there's value in that in a general sense, and whether it lives as a module or attached directly to item, you know, if it is in its own repository and managed separately, I would think that it would be included with item by default, right? Like you install item, you get this thing.
Yeah, I'll make a note of that and talk about it with Tom and R&D team.
Okay.
Getting it in item is pretty good. You'll get, or even pop if you prefer, but item is maybe more suited for that. And just imagine finding a fun name for pop utils or item utils. That'll just be a nightmare.
Can I ask one question here? To what extent? This is again probably my lack of being able to be really as engaged as some of you guys can be, but to what extent is item versus pop? Like what if pop is the framework? I feel like item is the layer at which I'm thinking about this. Is that the right way to go about this, or is there an importance to thinking across both layers? I mean, I'd like to. I'm actually not too attached to either way of thinking about it, but just like to know what it seems like is the right way to think about it.
Well, pop is just the plugin system, and then item is just the states and execution system from Salt. Is that?
Let me repeat my. No,
Sorry.
I don't know exactly how to absorb that, if you will. Like, because I feel like speaking about them as separate things is a good thing from the development point of view, but from the point of view of trying to implement something, it'd be nice to think of it in one place as either it's a whole, or it's one thing, or it's the other, or there's one lens I can look at it through, or there's another. Because I'm not clear at what I'm looking at, is I guess what it comes down to.
I'll try again, because with these OS specific, or not OS, these kernel specific projects we've made, I initially called them Pop Linux, Pop Windows, and I think Cedric said those names clearly aren't appropriate. It should be Item Linux, Item Windows, because those are the things that they're extending. So we need to look at what is the thing that's being implemented. Is this just a pop util, or is this an item util? Is that more where you're talking?
I understand that a little better, I guess.
And is at which level is this project? What is actually the base of my project? And
yeah, how many people would that question be coming up? I don't know. For me, pop apparently is a dependency in the way I'm thinking about this, and I have no interaction with it. And so, for instance, until I forget, I think it was you, Nick, who were like, "Hey, run pop this for a new project." I was like, "Oh, I didn't think to even run a command that said pop in it. I just was starting with item whatever because it seems like that's the place where I'm working on this." You know what I'm saying? The pieces and how they work together, there's a dependency there, but it's not clear how that's supposed to be invoked by me, the person who wants to step in here and write a state or write something under a state or write something under that.
The weird thing is that pop imposes the project structure and how you structure your code.
Yeah.
So that's how you use it.
Yeah, I mean,
but if you
writing
look at it also, it's so similar to Salt that you can kind of ignore the fact that pop exists, understand that there are execution modules and states, and just as I did, and it worked in the end, just, copy a whole bunch of stuff, and it's just directory structure. It doesn't really do a lot.
Yeah, I mean when you
don't
run,
get me wrong, I'm sure it does a lot, but I'm saying like it doesn't impose a whole lot beyond that on the person who is looking at it.
Yeah, I mean, a pop seed takes a lot of that thinking away from you, right? You know, it builds the framework on which, you know, you're writing a pop plugin at that point. You happen to be writing a pop plugin that is meant for item, but could that plugin be used in other regards? Sure, right? You know, if I wrote some other random pop application that required Azure functionality, I could merge those two pop applications together and get that Azure functionality for free. I would just need to know how to like call the keyword arguments and work with it and get the return and do things with it. But you know, ultimately, you know, creating things using the pop paradigm makes things infinitely reusable in you know, n number of applications as long as you're using pop as the framework on which you're writing things. Does that confuse things more or less?
No, I mean, the idea's out there. I guess I'm also inherently dubious of everything that's so abstract that it sounds like you're writing a new operating system. Again, no offense here. I'm being really cavalier with things that are probably really undeserved. So please, you know, take that
Take it with a grain of salt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you know, I understand. You know, salt in the entire field of configuration management is always potentially referred to as it's just like it's essentially just running a shell script, but it's, of course, it's clearly not.
Right.
But at a certain level, it comes down to that, and then at another level, you build it all back up, and describing things so generally doesn't necessarily improve the visibility or the ability to perceive what it is doing, what the value is, and what the way it operates is.
Gotcha. Well, I'm doing a time check here. I know we're going to get cut off at an hour. So I think the main thing, besides getting sort of a status on where you were, was sort of a call to arms, right? You know, the AWS existing state and execution module, and then also all of the things that aren't currently represented in SALT. It comprises a huge amount of code. So if there's anybody that wants to pitch in different sections of AWS, I'm sure Peter would welcome the help.
Yeah, absolutely. I am like I said, just I think the basics should be as simple as everyone said. I think maybe there's a lot of conversation to be had in the cloud channel, or if we wanted to get more specialized, we could find threads or maybe a temporary room to just say, hey, is the level at which the current Bodo modules, do they make sense? Like they follow the Salt API? Do we want to? I mean, they follow the AWS API. Do we want to follow storage being a part of virtual machines, or do we want that to be different? Little questions like that when we have an opportunity to ask the question, because right now cloud and Bodo are pretty unrelated. It could structurally be a bit nicer, a bit easier to approach. Or do we want it to just be called EC2 and pile it all in there so people can find things with from the Bodo 3 docs and map back and forth clearly? It's it's an open question. My inclination is that I like right now the disk, virtual machine, etc. But then I start looking at things like storage, and I'm just like I don't think that S3, Glacier, and various other things fit nicely into that category, and so I'm just not really clear how to go there yet. So I could use other people's input and considerations.
If y'all ever need a Zoom room to have a chat, mine is open and I have a paid account on it. So as long as I'm not using it, I'd be glad to host meetings for you all. Just let me know.
Thank you, Cassandra.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
So I have a couple of questions. I'm kind of new here. So like as you guys were talking, I was kind of going out trying to figure out like what's already out there and what needs to be done. Because there's already Salt Cloud, right?
Well, that's what you would think. But
looks like there's AWS modules there. Is that not the case, or?
So Salt Cloud is not an idempotent representation of, you know, how things generally work in Salt, right? Salt Cloud is sort of an out-of-band mechanism that uses entirely different workflows to stand up cloud instances only. And so what we're trying to do with Item is write cloud modules that work a lot more like Salt states, in that, you know, we can stand up a virtual machine, for instance, and change tags on it by changing what our state looks like, you know, what tags are passed in through the state module to AWS or Azure. And okay, now we have modified tags, or, you know, we want to be able to use Jinja loops to stand up multiple instances or things like that. That's not currently something that we can do with Salt Cloud. So moving it to a state system where the workflows are a lot more familiar to people who use Salt in their day-to-day configuration management type activities, I think makes a lot more sense.
There's also the other aspect. So this came from a couple of roots. Another is that a lot of the way that Salt Cloud implements AWS is via a custom-written AWS REST internal REST library to access that REST client, I should say, and so it doesn't get to move along at the same speed as Bodo 3, which at the beginning probably made sense because both of these things have been around for a long time. But at this point, Bodo 3 is now the official API. I mean, actually, Bodo 3 has been for a long time, but Bodo 2 was still current, I think, when Salt Cloud started getting made. And if you look at it, there's some really odd corners you run into sometimes. There are a lot of things you can't do on a virtual machine without implementing extra code in Salt Cloud itself. There are things that you can't do, like one of my favorites recently has been you can't stand up a node with an encrypted EBS disk just because all the ability is there. It's very transparent that you can pass in the options. However, you need to know that you can tell Salt to ask for a different Salt Cloud, that is, to ask for a different version of the EC2 API, because the version that it asks for by default is old enough that it doesn't know about encrypted EBS disks, etc. Most of these things would go away with something like Bodo and Bodo Core there, because all that stuff is handled dynamically, but it's just built on a different foundation. And so in moving that foundation, it makes sense to use something that is also going to be used in the future with Salt.
Okay. As far as, I guess, the code for this, where is all that being, is that still in the same repos, or this is happening in different repos, or?
Well,
I mean, so I try to go to like the, you know, the Salt Cloud repo that's there, and there's just a README that's like changed to Salt Cloud.
The existing Salt Cloud thing, right, used to be a separate repository, got rolled into the Salt repository. So it's in the main repository, all the cloud functionality is there. What we're talking about, though, and what Peter's been working on, is sort of rolling all of that AWS functionality out into its own repository that is a POP plugin for Item, which is, you know, sort of the next generation thing. And so, you know, it's not that we're trying to discourage Salt Cloud use or development, but anything that's going to take huge fundamental changes to how Salt Cloud as a thing operates should probably be more of a topic for how the Item plugin should work. There are existing AWS and Azure and others execution and state modules that live inside of the Salt repository that can be used in a similar way to how we're intending Item to be used. But a lot of them, especially the AWS ones, were written a long time ago, and you know, may or may not work as intended, depending on how many people actually use them. I can't really speak to that myself. So, you know, there's really two separate code bases that we're talking about right now. There's sort of like the legacy Salt Cloud and Salt execution and state modules that happen to be related to cloud. And then there's Item plugins for cloud.
So if I'm looking at the repo,
And
go ahead, I'm sorry.
there's also the fact that since with POP everything is a plugin, so you have separate repos for the Azure implementation and the AWS implementation and maybe other providers later on.
And they
So
aren't all necessarily
goal-
owned by Salt.
Is the goal then to rewrite everything in pop and item like modality, or like what's the?
Yeah. So for
That's kind of the goal, yeah.
yeah, for cloud at least, that's been the main direction that we've been taking for a little while, not terribly long. Sort of in the sense that the cloud functionality represents a good bit of code that is very fast moving. So to keep it tied to a large code base like Salt is problematic, right? If we're having releases for Salt, what are we at now, Tyler? We're like quarterly or 3 times a year or something like that?
Ideally, it'll be quarterly.
Yeah. So, I mean, even that, there could be n number of services that are released for a given cloud in a quarter. And it may or may not make that stable release. So we might have to wait half a year, which is a lifetime in cloud. So breaking that out into its own repository means that it can be developed and tested and released at its own cadence. So, if there is a new service that comes out for Azure and somebody wants to stay up all night and write a new execution and state module for it, and it gets merged and tested and released into the Azure provider, we could cut a release and say, okay, well, release 201 is now with this this new thing, go nuts, and people can use it the next day.
It also, from past experience in working with Salt, it makes it a little easier to deal with a branch that's more, with a repo and a branch that's more targeted to the cloud provider. Salt's development branch in the past, and I think you guys have changed the naming, but the development branch in the past has been pretty wild and woolly, and some of the stable branches have been relatively far off from that. And so it makes it a lot easier just to be able to focus on what you're trying to do rather than deal with whether or not it runs at the point in time when you are making a change as well.
Yep.
Okay. So I'm looking at the repo now in the Salt Cloud Clouds, and I don't see an Amazon. Is that the EC2 provider? That's
so that's another detail. That in this case, I've got a module called Item Provider Bodo AWS, but it's under my name right now. It's under and it's in GitLab because I believe that most of the development here is moving in that direction. So I kind of thought I would start it there in case I either wanted to transfer it or just copy the CI.
Yeah, and let me know whatever projects you work on for Item Cloud, because I'm keeping a list of to track them all in that Pop Awesome link I put in the chat.
Okay.
So yeah,
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Nick.
Let's go ahead and see if we can break out some of these links for different repositories into the Slack at least, and make sure that that Tyler's aware of anything new coming out, so you can keep track of it separately as well. I think it might be a good idea to, I don't want a month to pass before we talk about this again. Maybe we could take Cassandra up on her offer and sort of go through this again fairly soon. And Brian, I know you're in Maryland, so we can coordinate if you want to work out anything, with me directly. But having Tyler and Peter and other people on the call, I think would be beneficial. So maybe we could get the band back together, sort of out of the same cadence that we have the working group, because I want to, at least in the next 5 minutes or so, Tyler, you want to real quick throw it out for the group about the potential for a new provider, and then maybe we can talk about that inside of another out of band work session, because it's going to probably blow some minds here.
So quick pitch, an item cloud provider for Terraform.
And so what does that mean,
Rotten
Tyler?
Tomatoes.
Isn't that kind of crossing the streams?
So Tyler grabbed me and he asked me this, and I don't know, I have mixed feelings on it, but essentially, and I think Peter, you might have mentioned this like months and months and months ago, it would be using the Terraform API as sort of a back end, right? So it would be a way that you could represent your cloud states in a way that looks familiar to Salt people, but on the back end it uses the Terraform API. My personal thought on that is that it's really only useful if there's some automated mechanism to take existing Terraform stuff and represent it as YAML, which I think would be a difficult and interesting thing to do. But that's just my quick personal opinion on it. I haven't really thought about it too much, but I know that there's a lot of buy-in and heat around Terraform as infrastructure as code out there right now, and giving somebody sort of a different mechanism to interact with it. And
the idea too is that it would give us all the 40 or so drivers in Terraform, and then once we want to implement those on our own, then we can have them in like 100% Salt style or item style.
Yeah, so this
but it
would
would
be our
give us quick
fast
and dirty
pass to.
access to lots of cloud functionality.
So I just posted a link that isn't directly related to this, but it is another thing that I've looked at in terms of being able to interact with services that export protobufs, and I haven't gotten very far with that outside of experimenting. But this is something that Stripe's using called SkyConfig. I don't know if anyone, I mentioned Bazel earlier. It's sort of going to, if you end up using it, it's your way into build systems or that build system, and it has a underlying Python interpreter called Starlark or Skylark. I forget which it ends up. It starts at one and ends at the other. But it is a Python syntax that has a very specific purpose of implementing the build systems rules to make things both buildable, parallelizable, and in addition, it's got two runtimes. One's in Java, one's in Go. The Golang one can be used with protocol buff definitions to interact with APIs. I was mostly looking at it for, what's it called again? Envoy. But in theory, you can use it to interact with Kubernetes, as well as Terraform, with the notion that you can use it to generate appropriate type check messages, forward it to the service, or dump out messages, YAML, JSON, or as protobuf text format, or whatever you need. The reason I'm mentioning this is that I just want to make sure that as you're considering this, there's a body of work out there that talks about being able to interact, and it's not trivial, right? The way you do things with Terraform is a bit loosey-goosey because they have their own silly HashiCorp way of thinking about data and recording it. But I just want to, I think looking at what's out there should lead to a notion of what the difficulty is in making this work. But I think we need to discuss that another time. But my trivial response is that, from my point of view, it would be nice if Salt could do some of these things via Terraform. Like, I don't like Terraform managing launching systems because, hey, AWS can just take it away, or the cloud provider can take that instance away. And I don't love the fact that Terraform still has the notion of the state of something there. I like the fact that with Salt, you can forget about it a little more easily, but it's not fundamentally that different. But that's sort of a philosophical choice that reflects the architecture that I'm used to working with and the decisions we made. I don't think that it's a good first step. That's just in my impression. I think there's a lot of work that could go into it, and it's good exploratory work, but I would need to be convinced personally to try to use it. But we're a big Terraform shop. I like it. It does a lot of good stuff. Salt is, in a lot of respects, our second option for things that handle things that are more dynamic. I'm not sure how tying those together work right now.
Okay, thank you. And just as another side note, right now for R&D, I'm porting all of Grains to Pop, but in a month or so, I'll be full-time, 8 hours a day, working on getting item cloud to be fully functional. So it's really, I'm really appreciative, Peter and Nick, for your, and Cedric for your work in getting some of these core clouds onto item. And yeah, in just a little bit, I'll be able to do that full time too. Get
Awesome.
some of the more
And,
esoteric
I'm
ones
looking
in there.
forward to having greens if that's happening. That's cool too.
Mhm.
As a side note as well, I am Google Summer of Code administrator for libvirt organization, and I have 2 students that reached out to me to work on saltvirt modules so far. It'll be the salt ones rather than the pop ones, because at least I need to get the salt ones in a better state than what we have now. And well, let me know when we can do the full switch to pop, even for salt. I
excellent.
just don't want to maintain the two separate code branches for the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The happy path is that it happens at the end of the quarter before sodium.
Okay, let's see.
Realistically, yeah. if the stars align and everything happens to work out, just perfect.
All right. Well, we're at our hour. We could lose the Zoom at any moment here. I appreciate everybody coming out. It was a great conversation today. Let's coordinate via Slack to see if we can get another meeting set up sometime using Cassandra's Zoom. And I'm going to drop some links to the different repositories. So Brian, if you want to take a look at those and ask questions about, you know, how those things sort of fit together. I think that would be a good plan from here on out. Does anybody have any final parting words?
I'm going to get, oh, yeah, sorry, go on.
Go ahead.
Oh, I'm going to get these things, the work groups posted on YouTube. I'm going to upload them today, so they should be there tonight or tomorrow morning so people can refer back to this.
Awesome.
All right, great. Take care.
All right, bye. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Hi, everyone.
Bye all.